Welcome, welcome. Track Records, episode 19 with Kenny and Barry. Sorry if we missed you guys last week. We missed you, you missed us. We're back here. Barry, you want to fire off the fireworks, start the proceedings?
So before we were so rudely interrupted during the last episode, um, I was talking about Jane's Addiction
Right.
and my love for them and their original run back in the late 80s and early 90s, and their first three records, which I like very much. I'm a sucker. I'm still a sucker for really good, well done hard rock. And I think Jane's Addiction fits that to a T. Much like Zeppelin, they it sounds silly to say this, but they rocked really hard, but they also really knew how to write songs with a good groove, and that is something that's rarely found in hard rock, I think, in much the way that Zeppelin did it so well. I think Jane's Addiction did as well. That has a lot to do with their great rhythm section as far as building that great groove. Um, but anyway, what I really wanted to circle back on is that when we were talking about them, you had lumped them in with that whole grunge movement, and I have to correct you, Ken, man. They definitely were not. It should not be lumped in with that whole grunge movement, and I'll tell you why. A, they weren't from Seattle, and B, they started a little earlier, like I think around 85 or so is when they first started, but they were just their own thing in a sense that you would look at them, you wouldn't really know what the fuck to make of them as far as their stylistic choices. Um, the front man looked like some sort of weird hybrid shaman type character. Whereas like the guitarist and bass player were basically, you know, at that point looked like your typical meathead hard rock guys. But anyway, and their music didn't fit into that genre. If you want to use grunge as a genre, we're talking, the Seattle bands like Soundgarden, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, the usual suspects. So I just wanted to call out that distinction that I would certainly never lump them in with the grunge thing. They were just a separate entity, all by themselves, in my opinion.
And that's fine. And I wouldn't even argue that point. I would only say that I believe that they were fairly or unfairly, they were lumped in with that. Um, and that's also part of the labels. And also I always wonder who was the first person to come up with the word grunge? Who's the first person to come up with punk or new wave or disco or anything? Disco, you can see a little more, the link there, discotheque and all. But
Yeah,
it's just interesting. Like who was that? Who said this music is grunge? You guys, you're a grunge band, and you wear flannel. It's
uh,
sort of
it's
weird.
it's it seems like it's usually uh, something that the media, some facet of the media comes up with and coins a term so that these things can be marketed and they can be written about. And there's that famous story, or infamous story of, I think it was Vanity Fair, who called um, this woman who worked for Sub Pop at the time, like in the real early stages of the whole grunge thing, called up this person who worked at Sub Pop, who I think she was just like the desk person, the front desk person, and she totally fucked with the person from Vanity Fair because this reporter wanted to get the inside scoop on grunge, and she wanted to know about grunge, and I'm using quotes here, grunge terms.
Yeah.
And this woman, I think her name was Megan Jasper, if I'm not mistaken. She's somewhat legendary for doing this, and she totally made up all this goofy shit, all these goofy words on the spot to feed to this Vanity Fair reporter, who took them at face value and ended up writing this article about this music explosion, this new music scene in Seattle called grunge, with all these terms that she made up off the top of her head. It's kind of a infamous and very funny story.
It is funny. It's you got to be careful. Like it's funny how something like that spirals out of control or can spiral out of control. But that is funny. I did not know that story.
You
Um,
can look it up online and find all of the terms,
I'm sure.
and they're hilarious.
Yeah,
I mean, they really are funny. This person must have had an incredible sense of humor, and also must have been very quick to
yeah.
come up with all these goofy words on the spot. Things like I can't even remember them off the top of my head. Action slacks was one of them, and I forget what that had to do with some sort of pants or something. But you got to look them up.
No,
They're
no, that's good.
hilarious.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely interested. That is funny. When you're talking about Alice in Chains and Zeppelin and talking about the groove yeah, and the rhythm sections powering them, I was thinking about that. Actually, it's funny. I was thinking about that just the other day. I was thinking about, Zeppelin and the Who, and how their drummers, really powered the bands. And even with the Stones, so did Charlie Watts in a different sort of way than Bonzo or Mooney, but still, he definitely powered the Stones in a way that Ringo didn't power the Beatles. Like, he's a great drummer, like, and he's very steady. And he kept the beat, beautifully. But it's funny how when you think of all those bands, he was not like that. The Kinks drummer was, you know.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the type of music. So
Yep,
something like um, the Who or Zeppelin is so much more hard driving than
yep,
anything the Beatles ever did, minus say Helter Skelter.
right. Yep,
Um, but it's funny that you bring up Ringo and say, "Oh, well, he was a good drummer and he kept the beat." Ringo is Ringo is looked upon as one of the greatest rock drummers ever by almost uh, almost any great drummer of today. They will pick out Ringo as one of the best drummers, and it's not because he was this mammoth driving force like a Bonham or like a Keith Moon, or a Mitch Mitchell, from the Jimi Hendrix experience. But what Ringo had was this uncanny feel where he wasn't playing a lot, but what he did play fit the songs so well, and the timing was so immaculate and so much his own that it's almost like non-drummers don't appreciate him as much because there's happy-go-lucky Ringo with a big smile on his face playing in the background, and he was never over the top, but he had such a feel that was all his own, and that was such a big part of the Beatles sound that almost to a T, you talk to any, like I don't know, a contemporary drummer like a Dave Grohl or someone like that, and they're going to pick out Ringo as one of their favorites and one of the greatest.
it's interesting. Because and I don't dispute that. But again, it's like the people you mentioned, or Ginger Baker is another one
Mm-hmm.
where you think of those people first. I can't remember who it was, but someone referred to talking about Ringo, said you couldn't knock that guy off the beat with a crane. In terms of like how he just was so steady.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a different sort of thing, because you would never call Keith Moon a steady drummer. That was not his forte.
No, in fact, he was the exact opposite,
Yeah,
especially as he got older and got more and more fucked up personally.
yeah,
His drumming just got sloppier and sloppier.
yeah.
And you listen to some live Who shows from, say, the Quadrophenia tour or the Who by Numbers tour. His drumming at times is just downright awful. He had a really he's again, you know, one of my favorite drummers for
Yeah.
sure of all time. It's hard to beat a very young Keith Moon. Like, some of those early clips and the Kids Are All Right are just phenomenal. It's like this guy's an alien. He's playing so well and with such verve. Um, but I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with the
It,
later Keith Moon
yeah,
stuff? Just uh, he just he just got really sloppy, and
yeah.
I would say listen to something like on Who Are You compared to like something early like the original version of Can't Explain, or even Who's Next.
Yeah.
There's just no comparison. And I think it got, from what I've read, it got more and more difficult for Townsend and the rest of the Who to deal with Keith as his skills declined, as his health declined because of
Yeah,
alcoholism
his
and drug
skills, his
use.
availability. Yeah. No, and it's I think of Keith Moon like a meteor. Like he was just here briefly,
Yeah,
but
that's
during
what I
that time, you know,
that's what I meant to say is he had that limited, very limited window of
because
sheer brilliance. Like, what would you say was the era? Like, from what record to what record?
certainly, like I mean, that's if I had been, I was 2 years old, I think, when Can't Explain came out. But man, that would have blown me away. The staccato, rapid fire drum explosion in Can't Explain. And so from that to, I would say, yeah, probably Who's Next, and even by then, it's amazing. Like it was that fast because Quadrophenia is one of my very favorite Who records, if not my favorite, but not because of the drumming. It's actually it's end whistles bass that really powers Quadrophenia more than Moon's drumming. I mean, you can, if you listen to every Who album in turn, you can just see it's amazing how quick the decline was. Bonham, he there was a decline late, but his decline was much later than Moon's. Whereas Ringo, man, he's still drumming today. It's incredible.
Um, Bonham definitely had a window too
Yeah.
of greatness, but like you said, it was much longer. It was really from when Zeppelin got together to their second to last record, Presence.
Yeah.
Some of the drumming on that is, in my opinion, some of the best drumming he ever did on that first song on that record. What's it, Achilles' Last Stand? It's the song that Hart ripped off for Barracuda.
Okay.
It's basically the same groove
Yeah.
as Achilles' Last Stand, and the drumming on it is so incredible. In fact, I implore you to go out and check out a live version of that from, I think it might have been, it was on the last tour that Zeppelin did, the tour they did for In Through the Outdoor. But there's this great live version of that from that tour. I think it might be at Nebworth in England from 1980.
I was gonna say
And
1980. Okay, yeah.
yeah, and it's such an incredible version of that song. And that song's like this sprawling epic that goes on for like 10 minutes. And the drumming is just such a powerhouse, but and even more so on this live version. You got to check it out if you've never seen it.
But it's funny though when you say when you say sprawling epic, that's the sort of stuff about Zeppelin I didn't like. And I'm not talking about his drumming because I don't remember that track per se, and I've got to listen to it again. But so I was talking about Ringo versus his contemporaries, Zeppelin versus, and I've mentioned this before, versus like the Who or the Stones or the Beatles. Their lyrics just weren't that, you weren't the strong suit of the band. And it's why, and I like Zeppelin quite a bit, but it's why they were never my favorite band. So
Yeah, um, that makes sense. Knowing how important lyrics are to you, a lot of the Zeppelin lyrics are downright silly,
yeah,
and and also backing up, um, you know, the fact that lyrics aren't that important to me, or not as important,
yeah,
is I don't really care.
yeah.
Like,
No, and it
think
makes
about
sense. Yeah,
think about stuff like Whole Lot of Love, or
yeah,
I don't know, just any random Zeppelin lyric. They're usually kind of almost laughable,
yeah.
but they work so well, and they're such a big part of the whole Zeppelin
And that's
aura.
part of the problem. I don't know if problem is the right term, but with hard rock in general, hard rock is definitely more about the instruments than about the lyrics, and it's true across the board of those sort of bands. I really liked Aerosmith a lot, but I wouldn't say, oh man, their lyrics were brilliant. You know, um,
That's another example of a hard rock band that could groove.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah, no, and like I said, I was a fan. In particular, something like Sweet Emotion. What a
oh
classic
God,
track that is.
yeah,
Anyone who says that's not their best track is just out of their mind. That that stands alone from everything else they ever did. And again, I like a lot of the other stuff. Obviously, not their later stuff is complete shite. But again, they were never lyrically powerful. As opposed to in my ongoing quest to defend the power of lyrics, I will quote from one of my favorite. I'm going to quote each time. I'm going to quote a verse every time we talk. And this is from Steely Dan's first or second single, "Dirty Work."
Hmm.
Where he sings, like a castle in its corner of some medieval game. I foresee terrible trouble, but I stay here just the same.
Hmm.
That's just awesome.
It's clever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So,
clever. It's no baby, 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 baby,
yeah. Or
squeeze my, what is it? Squeeze my lemon till
yeah,
the
till the
juice runs
juice
down
runs
my
down my
leg.
thighs. Yeah. Or, or
Um,
or as I always rip on Bruce for "Ooh ooh, I got a crush on you." It's like, come on.
um, he was probably just having fun and probably said, it was probably thinking, God, I need to crawl out of this super serious mode that I've been in for most of my career. So I'm going to write just a throwaway pop song.
Well,
And it
not just
ended up being thrown on the river, probably without even him intending it to be in the first place.
but it's interesting because of what you say in terms of like, I've got to get out of this intense, in this and just have a fun pop song. That record has his most intense, like Independence Day and Point Blank,
Hmm.
and Drive All Night. Like those are like, dark, serious songs. And so it really is jarring to hear
Well,
that.
that's what I mean, because he
Yeah.
was probably down that rabbit hole
Yeah.
writing all those songs
Yeah.
and probably wanted to come up for air
Yeah.
and wrote that. Or what are a couple of, well, Hungry Heart would be another one that's kind of
Yeah.
a, in my opinion, somewhat of a throwaway pop song
Although at
in
least
much the
that he was
same
writing for
vein.
someone else. But yeah,
Who was he writing that for?
the Ramones.
Really?
Yep.
No shit. I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh. Huh.
He wrote it for the Ramones and then decided at the end that he was going to keep it.
And
Um,
it ended up really like breaking him into the mainstream.
yeah, it's interesting with him because he did give away "Because of the Night"
Yeah, to
to Patty,
Patty.
and she had a big hit with it. He gave away "Fire"
Yeah, to the
to
Pointer
first,
Sisters.
but also first to what was his name? Robert. He had a hit with it as well. What the
Huh.
hell is his last name?
I
I'll have to
didn't
think
know
about that.
anybody else
Yeah.
did that.
Yeah. And so I always find it interesting when artists give away a song. As a matter of fact, Mick gave away "It's Only Rock and Roll" to Bowie. And Keith
And
said, "What are you, fucking crazy?"
yeah,
and got him to take it back. And Bowie's like, "All right." And
so that's interesting. I'd never heard that either.
yeah,
But it makes sense because Bowie was, you know, the new great thing at that time. And when was that, 74 or
yeah,
something?
yep.
And
And they were
I
tight.
could,
Yeah.
yeah, that totally makes
And
sense.
you
And
could see Bowie doing it.
sure,
Yeah.
sure. Have you heard, speaking of Bowie and covers, have you heard his version of "It's So Hard to Be a Saint in the City"?
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
like that.
I really like that a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
And he did that back when, whenever that song came out on Greetings from Asbury Park, what was that,
73.
73?
Yeah.
So he very early on saw the greatness in Springsteen,
Mm.
clearly,
Yeah.
because he, somebody who was at the top of his game like Bowie was, you know, basically grabbed a song by a somewhat unknown songwriter
More
and
than somewhat
performer.
unknown. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
So
it's
that's
crazy. Yeah.
really cool. I got to go back to
Yeah.
Sweet Emotion though.
Yeah.
Um, what movie does that open?
I feel like I just saw it. Um, Shoot. Is it recent?
No.
Okay.
Well, I guess it's relative. It's from a little over 30 years ago. So
No, no,
at
no.
this age, that seems
Yeah.
somewhat
Yeah.
somewhat recent.
No, I can't think of it. Go ahead.
Dazed and Confused.
Oh, okay.
You're, they're
So
driving through the parking lot in that like late 60s muscle car, and it's in slow motion. It's one of my all-time favorite movie openings, and the pairing of that song with that scene, I think, is cinematic perfection. I really do. I get goosebumps every goddamn time I watch that. It's just so perfect, and
you're
it brings me back to that time. The mid that movie takes place in 76, takes you right back to what it felt like to live in that era and be at school. Everyone's showing up, the stoners over here, the jocks, and the cheerleaders, and listening to Aerosmith. It was just so perfect.
And so where do I live?
Where do you live now?
Yeah.
Well, of course, in Austin.
And
So,
I have never seen the movie.
you kidding me?
Nope.
Well, wow, that blows me away. And
There's
why is
I,
there a reason or?
yeah, there's something about like movies about high school, I think, except for Rock and Roll High School, which I love, the Ramones.
Mhm.
But Fast Times at Ridgemont High, I never saw that. I never saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Like and I know
That's
they're all
lame.
different. Yeah, no, they're all different and all. But there's something like to me, and I've seen bits of Dazed and Confused. Okay, I've never seen the whole film, but I've seen bits. But to me, I call that low hanging fruit,
Hmm.
and it's just easy to those characters are all stereotypes, and and although I realized I have read stuff about it and how they're like Spicoli in particular was based on a kid that the director knew,
Yeah,
so and went to school with, I believe. So
you're
um
you're talking Fast Times.
yeah,
Yeah,
so because those I always get those two, like I think of those in the same way. But there's certain and again, I shouldn't rip a movie I've never seen. It's just not my thing. And then there are movies where I think, oh, this movie's gonna be perfect for me, and I'm like, oh my god, it's terrible. Almost Famous is one of those examples. Um,
yeah. I
uh,
I get your point about having somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction to high school theme movies, especially they're basically trying to buy in on nostalgia. That's
yeah,
that's the whole gist of it. However, Dazed and Confused, and I'm hesitant to even recommend it now because obviously you get my feelings about it. I think it's one of the only movies that I could say is like perfect. Like I wouldn't change a thing in it. Um, but yeah, I don't know. And maybe the 30 years that have gone by would lessen the greatness of it for you seeing it the first time. But it's pretty fucking good, man, and pretty accurate and subtle. It's not like Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So much of it is the opposite of subtle. Like they got the stoners in the van, they fall out of the van, the pot smoke blows out.
yeah, stuff like that. Yeah,
There's all these subtle moments in Dazed and Confused that elevate it from that genre of movie, in my opinion. So, and you even live in Austin.
yeah,
That's so funny. You've never seen it.
yeah. And so as you can imagine, it does come up at times. Like I'll be watching the news, and they'll say something like, "Oh, and just like in Dazed and Confused," or "Oh, this pizza
Mhm.
shop," or this thing or that thing, because a lot of it was filmed on location. So
It has become somewhat of a how would you classify something that it totally nailed the zeitgeist of mid 70s to late 70s, and being a kid in high school still, and all the things that were part of our culture back then, music being first and foremost. So
and
in
it's
76 you would have been in what, like ninth grade or something?
uh um eighth grade.
Okay, so that's
Uh,
perfect.
yeah, and so and it's funny because then you take a film like Animal House,
Hmm.
which I love. Okay,
Hmm.
and it's a frat movie, and the last thing on the planet I would have ever done was join a frat.
Sure,
That like you would have had to put a gun to my head to get me to join a frat.
but
And yet there's something about the movie that the sense of humor is just more my sense of humor. It's sort of like I remember when I was like that age, like eighth grade or whatever. My sister and brother, my sister in particular, would watch Monty Python's Flying Circus, and
you're
I
like,
just didn't get it.
what the
Yeah,
fuck is this?
but
Why are you laughing?
once I got it, I got it, and
Hmm.
I'm a huge Monty Python fan.
You just
Um,
had to be a little older than an
yeah,
eighth grader.
but it's just funny when like you're like I don't get it, and suddenly the light bulb goes on, and so um and I really like when we were going over talking about favorite movies of all time. One of the ones you mentioned was Brazil, written by Terry
Hmm.
Gilliam from Monty Python, and I love that movie.
Hmm.
There's a movie that I like movies that make me think. And Brazil definitely does that. And so that's and again, it's does Animal House make me think? No. So obviously there are exceptions, but it just where my taste tends to go for the most part. And I was thinking, whereas I think of you, whenever I think of you in movies, I think of French Connection, The Friends of Eddie Coyle. It's got to be like a Mean Streets, Taxi Driver. It's gonna be gritty New York 70s.
Yeah, that stuff
Cars that get
definitely.
8 miles a gallon.
Yeah, I do love all of that
Yeah.
stuff, along with a million other
Yeah,
genres.
no, right.
But pretty much any, and this is one of the things so sadly missing from today's Hollywood is that back then, mainstream movies, back in the 70s, mainstream movies, 50, at least 50% of them were awesome.
Well,
And
there
that's not the
was
case anymore.
no, but that was also there was a run from 65 to 75 basically
Yeah.
where Hollywood was just at its finest, or I shouldn't even say Hollywood filmmaking, I should say. And those to me are the golden years, and actually probably the golden years of rock and roll too.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Uh,
and I sometimes think about how I and my friends gravitate towards the art forms, music, film, even sports, which is not an art form, but
yeah,
all the stuff from the 70s
yeah.
is what everybody typically gravitates towards as like when you think about the best era for all that stuff. And I've always thought, is it just because I was living my formative years then, and I'm just not being objective? But when you think about it, it's really just because all the stuff being made then was the best and it's never been surpassed.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth also to what you were saying before, but yeah, I think it was just great stuff. And it's funny, people often used to say they used to say this much earlier. God, I wish I'd been, like there, for Swingin' London or for the
Mhm.
psychedelic, San Francisco sound and all. And which I used to say all the time too. Then I realized I also would have been old enough to be drafted and go to Vietnam, and I wouldn't have been doing that. um and so because I watch movies and like when guys are dealing with a draft and they're showing Vietnam, it just like I can't imagine. I would never have gone. I would, if I had to flee the country, I would have just done that. I can't imagine. What would you have done?
uh, the thought of it's pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
Since we grew up after that, yeah,
And
I
it's
I
easy
don't
to
know.
look back and hindsight's 2020. you
Yeah,
know
yeah. Well, I do remember registering for the draft, but it's still, and that was during the height of the Cold War, but it still didn't ever feel like it would become a reality in
Yeah.
the sense that we'd get into some major conflict and myself and all of our peers would get drafted into some silly war halfway across the world, like what happened to the generation before us
Yeah. I'm
with Vietnam. It's
and
sickening to think about.
imagine watching them pick out ping pong balls on TV, like a lottery, except when you win, you don't win, you lose. Like, I mean,
Can't imagine it.
yeah.
We were very fortunate for a lot of reasons to be born when we were, but that's one of the big ones. Or imagine being around during World War II, for that matter.
At least World War II,
Served a purpose.
yeah,
Yeah,
I still would have had, I don't know what I would have done. But at least I would have understood that better with the benefit of hindsight. But not Vietnam and not Desert Storm, or the Falklands.
or any of them,
Yeah.
really, in
Yeah.
any of them.
I, I, I can't
After
imagine.
World War II,
I,
Korea.
yeah.
Uh,
I
uh,
just can't imagine
ugh.
like you've got to shoot this person or you've got to drop bombs on this person
Or
or yeah,
you've got to run your ass off so you're not the one being
yeah.
blown up.
And
Yeah,
imagine
it's
seeing
just
your friends. Think
insane.
about your closest friends and they're on your left and right and they're getting riddled. It's just whew, it, it, it's and it's funny because you watch a movie like Apocalypse Now and he's water skiing behind the boat to satisfaction and you're
Yeah,
like, this is so cool and you're loving the movie, but you're not really thinking about the reality of it. So
yeah, that was such that era, the late 70s. Again, going back to the 70s and great
yeah.
movies. Though that in rapid fire succession, those classic Vietnam movies that came out Apocalypse Now being maybe the best, and then there was like Coming Home, which is a completely different take on
Totally.
it,
Yep.
but no less powerful.
Yep. Deer
Uh,
Hunter, Platoon.
Deer,
Yep. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
Deer Hunter,
Yep.
obviously
Yep.
being one of the best. But speaking of movies,
Yep.
I just finished last night. I just watched a contemporary movie, but of course it was a documentary, and of course it was music themed,
Yep.
because there is no good narrative movies being made anymore unless you go outside of this country. And I swear it's almost to a T. You cannot tell me a good movie that has come out of Hollywood, like a really good movie that's come out of Hollywood, narrative movie in the last couple years. I defy you.
Okay. Challenge accepted. I will go
Okay.
over that with you. Okay.
Anyway,
Yeah.
and I've been and because of that, I've been indulging in mainly European, but a lot of Japanese movies as well, and just finding some gems. It just seems like uh, you get outside of this country, there's still great art being made in cinema. It's not all just cookie cutter, formulaic, mainstream direct. Just any I have the Criterion Channel. Just throw a dart at their list of films, and I don't know. It could be some movie from 1986 made in the Philippines, and there's something about it that will be really good. And that's my experience. But anyway, sorry, I'm
It's okay.
rambling.
Yep.
Um, this movie called The Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, or The Brian Jones Story, I think is what it was called, is made by that English documentarian Nick Broomfield, and it's exactly what you would think it is. It's documenting the period of the Stones from their inception through Brian Jones's getting kicked out of the band and then dying a couple weeks later. And it's pretty well done and pretty entertaining.
I started watching it. It
Mm-hmm.
must have been Canopy as well, or because I started watching it. The narrator's voice was so irritating. I couldn't get past it.
Really?
Yeah, like 10 minutes in, I was like,
Uh-huh.
because I'm fascinated by Brian Jones, the Rolling Stones, as you can imagine.
Right.
And so I wanted to watch it. I wanted to see it, but it was just too annoying. Just like that movie that came out on the Velvet Underground. I can't
The
remember.
Todd Haynes movie.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
God. I wanted to watch it. I love the Velvet Underground. The way he did the film, I can't even watch this.
I
Um,
remember you saying that,
yeah.
and that was before I watched it. So I went into it with low expectations, and I thought it was one of the better music docs I've ever seen because it took such a different angle on everything related to the Velvet Underground, and I actually learned some things from it. And at this point, it's like, oh shit, what are you going to learn from a Velvet Underground doc that you don't already know, or the same with the Stones doc.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm surprised that that was enough to keep you away from it because I find the guy who you're talking about is
Yeah.
the director,
Yeah.
and he does have a somewhat unique voice, but
Yes.
I think that adds a flavor to it that makes it stand out from the typical doc, in
And I
my
could see
opinion.
why some people would. And for me, it had the opposite effect. Because again, I wanted to watch it and I
Mhm.
tried hanging in there. And I was like, no, this is like nails on a chalkboard. I can't deal with this.
I
Um, as
sorry.
I was gonna say, as opposed to, I was just watching the Tom Petty documentary, which is on Canopy as well. Which, by the way, you got to really like Tom Petty way more than I do because it's over 3.5 hours long.
Yeah,
Okay,
I know that.
but it's by Peter Bogdanovich,
Mhm.
and so it's like,
Speaking of great 70s movies,
yeah, and so it's really done like a movie. It isn't, oh, let me try this, let me try that. It's like, no, let me make a film like the way a film is supposed to be made, just in terms of let's start here with the early days and let's go to Mudcrutch and then this, then his battle with the record companies and then, this and that.
mhm.
The highlight, by the way, is when during the Traveling Wilburys part, George Harrison is saying about how much he enjoys writing songs with Tom and with Jeff Lynne and all. And he goes, because in my previous band, that's not how we wrote songs. And, and at first, I was like, previous band. I was like, oh, the Beatles. Like, and it's just, but the way he said it was just like he was saying, the whatevers, and it was just so funny to,
Tongue slightly in cheek, no
yeah.
doubt.
But and George Harrison has a great sense of humor, and also, so
Mhm.
he probably did mean it. But again, the way when you're watching it, it doesn't feel like it feels like that, like was just natural for him to say. And it was just so funny because that's never how the Beatles wrote songs. Yeah, so
Um,
especially with George. So
um, Going back to the narrator's
yeah,
voice in that movie, I have a feeling he was very conscious of that fact that his voice might be unappealing to some viewers because in his other movies that I've seen, his voiceover is way more prominent than this movie. So
that's interesting.
the movie that comes to mind that brought him to my radar was a movie called Kurt and Courtney
Yeah.
from about maybe 20 years ago at this
Mhm.
point.
Yeah,
And it's about,
obviously.
obviously,
Yeah.
and it's really well done,
Mhm.
and it's somewhat salacious. I think that's the angle he takes with his documentaries because he wants an audience, and that kind of stuff usually will pull people in more than say a straight doc where there's not a lot of dirt, so to speak. Um, but
Yeah.
anyway,
So I was watching. So I got I think as far as Anita Pallenberg,
uh-huh. Oh, so
and
you got a
so
ways into it.
and then because again I wanted to,
Hmm.
and it was like so home movie type stuff that I'd never seen before. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was the kicker for me is
Yep.
all this great footage
Yep.
from the early to mid to late 60s that had never been seen before. At least
Yeah.
I'd never seen it
I hadn't seen
before,
it
and
either. If you
it's
ever get a
cool.
chance, though, this movie I believe is out of print. I saw it uh, back in the '70s in Cambridge, and
Let me guess.
what?
Ladies and gentlemen, the Rolling Stones. That one?
No, no, that's much more well known. That you can actually get a copy of.
Yeah.
It's called Charlie Is My Darling.
Oh, okay. I've heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah, get that. Because it's got some really good live stuff in there.
So
It's all
remind
black
me,
and white.
what's the gist of that? Like the era, and what's the
S-
focal point of
So
that
it
movie?
didn't come out until late '70s or the '80s, but it's all black and white, and it's from the stuff is from like the mid to late '60s. The footage.
Hmm.
And it's just I don't remember that well. I don't remember the narrative. I don't think there was much of one. It was more just seeing clips of the Stones because I'd seen them on the Tammy show, like the ones you see all the time.
Sure, the
And this
famous
was
stuff.
yeah, and this was stuff I'd never seen
And
uh,
where'd you see it?
in Harvard Square Theater in Cambridge.
Yeah,
And so because that or the no the Brattle Theater because that's the sort of stuff that they would show. Um,
back when there was repertory theaters like
yeah,
on every block in cities like Boston.
Yep, that's all changed. But it was great. And I remember when Kids Are Right came out, I was blown away because I had never seen almost any of that footage. And so it was just so great to see. A lot of the Tom Petty stuff I hadn't seen either, and it was interesting, but I'm not a big Tom Petty fan. So it was only interesting to a point. It was funny. Dave Grohl was so excited when they asked him to fill in on Saturday Night Live.
Hmm.
It's like he never played with Nirvana. He was like, they could have asked any drummer. They asked me. And he is like a huge Tom Petty fan, which is just bizarre. And Stevie Nicks said she wanted to leave Fleetwood Mac for to be in the Heartbreakers.
Oh, really? I don't.
But Tom Petty
Yeah,
told
I
her
don't
we
remember
don't
that.
have any women in the band.
Oh, he'd be canceled for that today.
But it's funny. That's how much she really liked him that much. And it's funny with her career because when Fleetwood Mac invited Lindsey Buckingham, they just invited him.
Yeah,
And he said, I'll
I know
join
that.
if I can bring my girlfriend.
Yeah,
And man, what if he had joined without her? You wouldn't have rumors. I mean, they wouldn't have become the band they were. And it's not like I think Stevie Nicks is like, better than sliced bread, but she obviously made a big impact on the band and on their
she
record
was
sales.
pretty great in Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah.
That adding those two to that band, not only did it make them basically the most commercially successful band in the world, but
Yeah.
those records are also really good.
But
The
it's
one that's just
crazy. Imagine if you're in a band and you've got a shell of a band because people
yeah,
have left, and you're
yeah,
like, and this is like a Hail Mary.
totally.
Uh,
Like she was a waitress at like in San Jose, California,
Yeah.
trying to make it in music, and her and Lindsey Buckingham had put out one record that
One.
went
Yeah.
nowhere.
Yep.
And yeah, that's a good description of it as a Hail Mary. Like, fuck, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie are sitting around.
Yeah.
God, Bob Welsh just left. We kind of had a hit with him.
Yeah.
And we were originally a blues band. We
Yeah.
sold a few records, and yeah, the progression and fan